Just checking that you can see my.
Hello, hello, welcome everybody. Well, great to see everybody here. 50 people in climbing. Welcome, welcome. Special webinar tonight on SPNI's webinar series with a member of Knesset Alon Tal, iconic figure in Israeli environmental history and current reality. My name is Jay Shofet, coming to you from Tel Aviv. Welcome everyone. 100 participants already. Thank you, Sandy, for starting off the chat. Please write in and let us know where you're tuning in from. Welcome everyone from here and far, near and far. This is our regular Sunday evening in Israel webinar series. Welcome to everybody. Good morning in the West Coast in the States and good afternoon in the East Coast and throughout Europe and wherever, people coming in from all the places, Toronto and Austin. I want to thank a special shout out to all our board members, hardworking volunteers of our American and Canadian and British and French affiliates based in Austin, Texas and Toronto and London and Paris. So thank you all for your support, your interest. Iris Hahn, our CEO, is going to be with us tonight, maybe to say a few words at the end, if so. Iris, welcome. We can see you and Alon here. We're already with 125 people and climbing regularly. Welcome to our Facebook audience. Avi, I assume we're live on Facebook. Avi Sadiv is doing back office in Toronto, head of our Canadian SPNI. So
yes, we are live on Facebook.
And we're live on Facebook. Great, thanks Avi. Hi to Russell and Jonathan, our board members calling in from Dutchess County, New York, my hunting grounds. Alon, I know you're from North Carolina. I don't know if we have anybody on from, are you from North Carolina? Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't know if we have anybody on regularly that I can think of from North Carolina, but probably we do and we will. Thanks, get going in just a minute here. I want to just welcome everybody. Numbers are still climbing.
Julie Harris is from North Carolina.
Okay, and Michael Klein, his parents lived in North Carolina. So we really get people from a global audience here and it's great to see, appreciate the support, the interest, the feedback from all of you. Please, please you can write your questions in the questions and answers. You have specific questions during the webinar and we'll get to them at the end. I want to welcome everybody. My name is Jay Shofet. I direct partnerships and development for the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel, based here in Tel Aviv. We welcome people from around the world and especially our supporters of all our affiliate organizations in the United States, Canada, the UK, France, but wherever you're tuning in from, appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. We have an exciting, exciting evening tonight. With us is a legendary figure in the Israeli environmental movement, Alon Tal, member of Knesset Alon Tal of the Blue and White Party. Alon is really a historic figure. He's been in the environmental business a long, long time in Israel. He founded the Arava Institute, what is it, in the late 80s. And after that, Adam Teva V'Din, the Union for Israel Environmental Defense, the kind of legal arm of the environmental movement, a couple of very successful and critical environmental organizations in the development of the Israeli environmental movement. He's been an activist in the Green Party. He's gotten to the Knesset recently. He's been an activist in other areas of Israeli life as well, religious pluralism, made Aliyah in the 80s from North Carolina, I believe, through Young Judea. Zionist success story, and really from the 80s, one of the leaders of the true respected leaders in the environmental movement, professor of environmental science at Ben Gurion University and Tel Aviv University. He's taught at Stanford and probably other places. He's got a long and impressive biography. We're very, very honored to have Alon with us here tonight. Iris Han, our CEO, also here, joins me in welcoming him. Alon will talk a while, show us a short presentation, about 45 minutes, and we'll leave time for questions and answers, which I'll feed to you, Alon. I'm sure there will be many. So, and if there's anything urgent or things we don't understand in the middle, I'll take the liberty of interrupting you, but otherwise, please, the stage is yours, and we appreciate very much you being here, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We're up to close to 170 people already. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Jay. Good evening, Iris, and to all the supporters of the Society of Protection of Nature in Israel. It is an honor to participate with such a critical and important organization. The great human rights leader, Martin Luther King, once said that there are times when tomorrow is not today, and it is possible to be too late. That's what we're talking about today, because the kinds of challenges which the natural world faces in the planet in general, and Israel in particular, are those which can't wait at all. And I kind of, if I would say something about my own personal biography, Jay mentioned I did move from the United States. And I think when I first came to Israel, at first I had a sense that maybe I'd kind of missed the boat, that the storied, heroic, and exciting time to have lived in Israel would have been maybe around the middle of the last century, when the so-called Palmach generation got to create a whole new country and change the course of history in this land. But as time went on and I lived in Israel, I realized that we are the blessed generation. We're the ones who are the lucky ones, in a sense. I don't know if it's lucky, but we're the ones who have the responsibility, because over the next 5 to 10 years, the future of this country, in terms of its biodiversity, its natural systems, in terms of the landscapes that we all love, whether anything will be left to it, that's going to be pretty much determined. And it is now that we have to decide whether or not we're going to draw some lines and stand up and fight. And there's reason to be alarmed and concerned, but there's also reason for hope. And one of the main reasons for hope is this organization called the Society of Protection of Nature in Israel. Obviously, you know that, or you wouldn't be coming in on a Sunday to hear bad news, but also good news about what we can do. But it is, like I said, a real honor to be invited to come speak by Israel's oldest and largest environmental organization. I thought what I'd like to do is start with sort of a very brief history, because the discussion today is about the sixth mass extinction. And scientists tell us that the world is spiraling into this direction. Israel, I think, also is in a biodiversity crisis far more serious than anybody, at least not the officials, would like us to believe. And it's important to understand why this is so unfortunate. And the reason is that the state of Israel, for its first 50 years, was a remarkable success story. Israel was an ecological makeover. If we take a look at the sort of the scope of history, you need to open up your Bibles and know, of course, that this land teemed with life of all different types. I mean, the fact that, that there were lions written about in the Bible means that there were actually lions wandering these parts and all kinds of critters. But over the millennia, as conquerors came and went, and forests, 97% of the natural forest cover was wiped out. That's not Zionist propaganda, that we know from aerial photographs. As that happened, the natural system started to take a hit. And the British mandate, there were some good things that happened to it, but a lot of bad things that happened as well. Animals that used to be sort of a very exciting part of living here, cheetahs and ostriches and bears, alligators, crocodiles, to be more precise, just disappeared. Because there was a tolerance towards hunting and habitats had been ravaged. When we think about the land of Israel, we think about the landscape that we love, we have to remember that a lot of it is highly degraded, because over the thousands of years that humans lived here, there were many incentives not to take care of the land. When the Turks were running the place, we had a situation where you were taxed by if you're having trees, if you had trees in your, so of course you cut down the trees because you want to pay the taxes. And so if we sort of fast forward to 1948, when the state of Israel was established, Some of the ecosystems were relatively intact, but some of the animals and natural systems were absolutely devastated. In fact, when the first IUCN Red Book, the Red Book is that sort of very discouraging catalog of species of animals and plants that either are extinct or are going extinct. And when the first one was published in the 1950s, one of the animals that was in there as under extinct was the Israeli ibex, okay? Apparently extinct, because all we knew is this is one taxidermological thing that now you can come see in the Natural Museum of History at Tel Aviv. But basically there were none to be found anymore because they had been hunted out of extinction. The Turks destroyed a whole lot of forests during World War I, but most of all, they left a lot of guns around, and those guns got in the hands of people who, wanted to eat or hunt for sport. And they thought that the ibex were gone. And we all know that ibex are not gone. If you go visit Stable Care, you'll be harassed by flocks of ibex or Mitzpe Ramon or Engedi. But the fact of the matter is that the ecosystems were on the ropes in the 1950s. And some very exciting things happened to change that scope of history. It's in no way self-evident that Israel had to preserve these systems. One of the legendary figures that you may have heard of was a guy named Henrikh Mendelson, was a German professor who moved to Israel in the 1930s. And he was the first ecologist in Israel. And he wanted to study medicine when he was, I interviewed him before a book I wrote. And he said, yeah, I really wanted to be a zoologist. My parents wanted to be a doctor because Jewish boys weren't supposed to be zoologists. So I made a deal. If I got a degree in medicine, I could get on the side a PhD in zoology. And we're lucky that he did. And he moved to Israel. And as the first sort of starting was just the antecedents of Tel Aviv University, he had a very gifted master's student named Amot Zahavi. And Amot Zahavi said, I'm going to, I'd like to see about that Chula wetlands up in the north. And he said, you better go up there fast because those nuts of the JNF are going to drain that swamp. You better see and catalog all those rare bird species. And he did that. And he finished his master's degree. And as a result of the failure of preserving it, he and his buddy Azar Alon founded the SPNI a few years later. And of course, it was in Henrikh Mendelson's lab where his doctoral student, Amot Zahavi, for 15 years, sort of hoodwinked the Tel Aviv University administration. And instead of writing a PhD dissertation, he ran an organization, which you now know to be the SPNI. And eventually they said after 15 years, you can't write a PhD dissertation for 15 years. And he went off to Oxford and finished it and went on to become something of a legend in the world of zoology and maybe the most influential Israeli naturalist ever to be in history. But in the meanwhile, we had a whole new way of looking at nature. And Mendelson, in the first year of the state, went to the Minister of Interior and said, we've got to ban hunting altogether. All of our ecosystems are on the ropes. And they did that. And it didn't take long before signs of reemergence began to happen, rehabilitation. And if we look at the subsequent 50 years, it's a series of successes for the most part. No more extinctions. We didn't lose any more species. In fact, animals that we thought were lost came back. A nature reserve authority was established because of the lobbying of the SPNI. And the government got in the conservation business. And over time, Israel became almost a poster child in the world about how a country that had been so very, very, degraded and insulted and ecologically could come back. And that nature was very resilient if we just let it do so. And that brings us up to about 10 or 20 years ago, when I think that we all felt that those sort of the glory years. I wish I could say that we continued from strength to strength, but things have changed in the last several years in Israel. And when you look at the Israeli red list, I mentioned that, but the SPNI has that on their website. You can go see it in English or in Hebrew, which categorizes what animals in Israel are either extinct or going extinct, or in danger of extinction, so to speak. You'll find that about a third of the vertebrates are defined as going extinct. And that might be worse than what it is, but because those numbers are a little bit old. We're finding ourselves truly in a situation where I believe that we have to act extremely quickly, and dramatically, and decisively if we want to preserve the habitats which are going to allow our children and grandchildren to have the kinds of experiences that we have in nature. And we all know, I imagine if there's 203 people, I'm just blown away, Jay. I think this is an incredible turnout for a Zoom gathering. But obviously these people have hiked, and you know how exciting it is to turn the corner and to see a gazelle, or to see a wolf if you go out at night, and all these kinds of incredible wildlife that you could, I said you could find them in the Bible, but they're still here for the most part. They're still here. It's not too late to save them. But the trends are of great concern. And the thing about preserving nature is that sometimes it's just too late. And that's sort of my major point. Now, I'm sure that many of you who are environmentalists have heard that there is a new name for the time in which we live. There's different periods of time. We live now in the so-called Anthropocene. The geologists say there's no place on the planet Earth almost which doesn't bear the footprint of human involvement. And Israel too is a place where essentially you can't find anywhere where humans haven't been and are have made, usually for the worst, an impact. But as a result of this, as I'll show you a few slides quite soon, population growth, we find ourselves in a situation where the natural systems simply are being fragmented. The number one reason for extinctions in the world has to do with the fact that you need a critical mass of habitat for animals, because they, at some point, don't have the genetic diversity, don't have the ability to feed themselves that they need, and they dwindle into loss. And there's other reasons too. There's hunting, and we have a little bit of that in Israel, though we still have fairly draconian hunting laws. I'm happy to talk about them. There's also the new problems that we have associated with invasive species that we didn't expect to come into Israel with such ferocity, and all of a sudden challenging the lands, the niches in the ecological systems of other animals. But I think that when we look at Israel's specific pathology, we have to realize that we are crisscrossing this country with roads, with houses, with shopping malls. Israel started its history with about 1 million people, slightly less. And every decade, another 1 million people join the country, except now that it's 1.5 million. And we're looking very, very soon to go reach 10 million people, okay? Now, we're not unique in this. The Jordanians, neighbors, they share similar ecosystems, and in fact, we have many, many areas in common. They started with 500,000 people in 1950, and now they're around 12 million people. So they grew even faster than us. But the point is that as more and more people filled the land, the sort of axiomatic dynamic that we know exists in the world began to manifest itself. And that is more people, less nature, which means that we have unique challenge in Israel. And I want to show you a few slides, I promised, from a report that we made not so long ago. As you look, there's a book actually came out in English in Yale University Press first, The Land is Full. But as a result of that, I started an organization with a friend of mine, Eyal Rottenberg, a professor from Weizmann Institute, which was an organization called Tzafuf, which means crowded, which looks at how can we adapt to the high density in Israel. And we made a report that came out in July, and it was shockingly resonated across Israelis media. I mean, top stories across everything, because of the first time we took a look at what's going to be in Israel in 2050. And 30 years from now, when Israel's population is doubled, and we're not looking at 10 million people, but soon to 20 million people, what's that going to be like? And I thought it might be worthwhile to have some idea of that, because that's what we have to think about as we think strategically about what we need to do to save this. So obviously, open spaces are important. If you go to the beaches, you can see they're more and more crowded. And the amount of open spaces lost that we're losing is going up all the time. In fact, we know that now about 22 square kilometers of open spaces disappear every year. And I want us to stop and think about that for a second. What does that mean when 22 square kilometers disappear every year? Israel only has 22,000 square kilometers. So it's a significant amount of land that we lose. But when we look at 2050, that means that we'll have lost an area 8 times the size of Tel Aviv. It would be as if we took the area of land of the Kinneret Lake, the Sea of Galilee, and multiplied it by 4 times. That's the amount of land we're going to lose. Now, if this land was strategically located in some of the more remote, dry, and dismal areas of the desert in the south, we might be okay. But these lands are going in the most fertile agricultural lands and the most important habitats, because that's where people want to live, where there's water, where there's landscapes near the center of the country or in the beautiful north of the Galilee. And as a result of that, we need to realize that this is going to, this doubling of population that because of the demographic momentum is one that's going to be an enormous challenge if we want to preserve nature, okay? Because take a look at the amount of open space per person in Israel is going down, and look at the amount of space, say, take coastline, okay? When I started working trying to protect coast in Israel, there was about 3 to 3.5 centimeters of coastline per person, you know, somewhere in the order of, I don't know, 2 inches. Well, right now we're at 1.5, and in 30 years, we're going to be at 0.8. That's a very, very small amount of coastline. I'm fighting in the Knesset to try to pass a law that would cancel about 30 plans who exist for old coastal development plans that were passed, most of them in the last century, which haven't been used yet, but could come back to life at any moment. And I keep saying, you don't understand, where are our children going to play on the beach if we sell them off, okay? And this has all kinds of problems in terms of what that means, loss of open space, in terms of with climate change coming in, with the tremendous paving over of the soils that should be percolating down into the groundwater, but instead we have that, and what we lost in terms of that. So what I wanted to make the point here is that as we go forward in Israel, we have to realize that a lot of our assumptions in the past can't be continued. And we need to realize that we are going to have to do. Now, I'd like to say something about what can we do now if we look forward and we see this loss of species. Just an example before I go on, just to give you just a sense of how I think the problem is so severe. The gazelle's gazelle, the land of the gazelle, Israel has a unique endemic gazelle species. Doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It used to exist in Jordan. It used to exist in Syria, but those gazelles were all hunted out of existence several years ago. And so it's up to us. We're the only country in the region that really cares about wildlife to save the gazelle. And this gazelle has always been a keystone species. When they started making nicknames for the land of Israel, there's lands of milk and honey, but one of the main ones was the land of the gazelle, Eretz HaTzvi, one of the main nicknames for the land of Israel. And yet we see that the gazelle was put on the IUCN's red list for globally endangered species about 3 years ago, because the numbers just are dropping. We used to have about 15 to 20,000. Now we're down to 1,200. Okay. And that's an indicator species. I'm not talking about, certain kinds of amphibians, which are probably a lot less sexy. What's happening to our salamanders, completely wiping out. I don't want to give you even the esoteric species, just even the iconic ones that we really want to be working with. So as we think about what we can do, I want to talk about what I believe this government needs to do, and hopefully leave you in a sense that we can do better, and what you can do to lend a hand. So if I can spend maybe the next 5 minutes doing that, and then we'll open up for questions and the like. There's no question the world has recognized that when you are facing fragmentation and animals are locked into smaller and smaller islands, so to speak, the single most important strategic thing you can do is create an ecological corridor, a passageway so that animals can move back and forth and have the kind of genetic diversity. So in fact, you can double the size of a habitat by connecting it to another one. And as early as 20 years ago, Israel got a map from its Nature Reserve Authority. Dr. Yeshua Shkedi, who's the long time now chief scientist for the Nature Reserve Authority, offered us this map. Unfortunately, it never ever received statutory recognition. It never received protection. And so many times these corridors, which could exist, even if it's going through agricultural fields, are truncated by fences and by the like. So I would like to hope that what we could do in this Knesset is make a special law which would grant protected status to these narrow corridors, which will allow the animals to go back and forth. And they work. You can go there in some of these places. They put some of them even over highways in Israel, and you can sit there. It's at night. It's like you go to Dizengoff Center and see people bustling about. You can see the animals crossing these overpasses over highways and using them, because they realize they have to get from one place to another. We need to make many, many more of those, and we need to protect them. And many times when there is a clash between the agricultural objectives of Israeli farmers, which are completely legitimate, and the natural systems that they come in contact with, it's time that we tell the farmers, listen, our natural systems are in really bad shape. You're going to have to give way. You're going to have to not put up a fence, even if it means that maybe those wild boars will destroy a few of your plants. And I think one of the things that I'm meeting actually tomorrow with the Minister of Agriculture, when I talked about creating a new kind of agricultural insurance, so that when a farmer in good faith is willing to open up his land so the animals can pass through, and he has his crops damaged, he can, just in the same way if there's extreme weather events, he can get crop insurance. He should be able to receive compensation. So that's one area that I feel is very important, where we don't have enough laws, and I'm trying to do something there. Now, another area where I'm going to be working quite vociferously or quite energetically is the issue of urban nature sites, okay? Protected natural systems in cities. There's a famous professor from the University of Arizona, Professor Rosenzweig. He's an ecologist, wrote a book called Win-Win Ecology. And his argument is that the battle for biodiversity cannot be won without integrating cities. Cities are too large in space. They hit two central areas. One of our great examples might be the area of Eilat, which has a fantastic bird park. And our bird parks, the Eilat Bird Park is a critical fueling ground for 500 million birds that fly every year from Europe down to Africa and back. And when they cross the Sahara Desert and cross the Red Sea, they are exhausted. And if we didn't have that bird park in the city of Eilat to provide them with the calories they need to finish their journey back so they can go and get pregnant again and start the cycle around, many of the bird populations wouldn't make it. So that's just sort of one of the examples he puts in his book, but there's so many examples. That's from the nature's point of view. And I want to say a word or two about the human point of view. I chair a committee in the Knesset, which is called the Committee for Environmental and Climatic Impacts on Health. And we recently, on Tu B'Shvat, the birthday of the trees, according to Jewish tradition, we had a special hearing about the mental health impacts, or the importance of natural systems for mental health. And the research is absolutely fascinating, but also emphatic and unequivocal. People need nature for their mental well-being. When there's a book that came out in the United States called Last Child in the Woods about 10 years ago, where they talk about this new psychological problem called nature deficit syndrome, where children who grow up with helicopter parents who never let them go outside, who sit in front of 150 television stations or surf the internet, they literally go mad. There's more Ritalin sold for the children of the United States today than there are antibiotics. That's a crazy statistic. And I know when I was growing up, my mother would kick me outside, and I lived in North Carolina, and we'd go run around and play in the place was completely forest. Children don't do that today, and they lose something about it. There's something about, when I think about why I'm so glad to have raised my children in Israel, part of it was they grew up outdoors. They were in youth movements. It gives a sense of confidence, a mental stabilization, and it's not the same as playing in a playground to play in nature. And so I say all this because one of the things we learned during the recent an ongoing COVID pandemic, when we were all in lockdown and people were relegated to a sort of a kilometer circumference or radius around their homes, people went a little further than a kilometer, but they couldn't really get in their cars and go anywhere. That wasn't allowed. And so they discovered all of these fantastic, long forgotten sites inside of cities where, against all odds, small ecosystems survive. And when the Ministry of Environment mapped them out, there was about 100 of them, 100. And these nature sites that are in the middle of the cities are all targets for development. And as Israel tries to work very hard to produce 60,000 new homes every year, only next year it's going to be 61,200 because we grow by 2% a year, we have to do everything we can to save those sites now. And I'm very, very happy that the Minister of Interior, Ayelet Shaked, who's not considered exactly a zealot on behalf of nature and open spaces, and the Minister of Housing, who was a former Minister of the Environment, Zev Elkin, and a range of other people, certainly our Minister of Environment, the very gifted Tamar Zandberg, they are all on board as we try to take this commitment to the natural systems in the cities and give them real protection. And so I'm very pleased that along with there's sort of a guild of all the municipalities, all the cities in Israel have their own sort of trade organization. Along with them, I'm working on a lot, and I hope that we can take these 100 sites and create a grant program so that particularly cities that are in poor socioeconomic areas can get the support they need to preserve these lands. The third law I'm going to talk about is the law of, which is now running through the Knesset. Hopefully we'll pass it. Already passed the preliminary reading. The first reading is coming up in a couple of weeks. It's a law which for the first time would allow Israel to meet its commitment under the Biodiversity Convention in the area of monitoring. You know, in 1992, the world came together in Rio de Janeiro. The UN sponsored it, and a special treaty, a convention was passed to protect biodiversity, and Israel signed it right away. But we didn't necessarily do what we promised to do in terms of monitoring. And there's no way you can begin to have a really effective strategy to protect the nature we love if you don't know where it is, how it's doing, and the like. As they say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so what this law would do, it was create a much more robust system of monitoring, bringing all the different components. Turns out there's 7 different arms working in different areas for a single report. And every year, the Minister of Environment is going to have to come to the government of Israel, the cabinet, and to the Knesset Interior Environment Committee and lay down that report and say, this is how nature's doing. The reason why I made this law was about 5 years ago when we have a sort of this nature, state of nature report. The Minister of Environment didn't even show up for the first time it was presented. And I asked him later, why didn't you come? And he said, I didn't know what was going on. I said, well, your name was on the schedule. And I realized there has to be a statutory expectation that ministers care about these issues and that we as the Israeli public and you as those who love nature everywhere, but certainly in Israel as well, know that on our watch, we are not going to let species disappear and ecosystems become desolated without anybody even knowing it. There's going to be ample warning, and decision makers are going to have to make decisions. Am I willing to give up this new development project to let nature thrive? I'm going to wrap up my talk now because I did want to, if it's going to be an hour, I'd like to give most of the time, or at least half of it for Q&A, but I'll just say this in closing. You know, we talk about preserving nature for the future and stopping the sixth extinction. I guess I should say a word about the sixth extinction. I didn't even get to that. The sixth extinction, of course, is the next in a series. There's been 5 mass extinctions the planet has seen. The 5th one was during the dinosaurs. And the 6th extinction, according to scientists, is what we're going through now. 1 million species on the planet right now by the UN are considered to be in danger of disappearing. And in Israel, we have dozens more. And when we let species disappear, we are stealing from our children. We are telling them that the genetic diversity and the potential for life that we enjoyed they're not going to receive anything as nice. This notion of intergenerational justice is at the heart of sustainability. And if you ask me, it's also critical when we think about what we want to leave our children, because stealing the natural heritage of our children is a terrible act. Stealing from children is maybe the most despicable of crimes. We have a chance to do differently. And I'm very honored to be in the Knesset to try to do something about it. But I'm just one member of Knesset with 3 gifted staffers. It's not enough. And one of the reasons I feel like I'm starting to make some progress and headway is because I have this incredible civil society and environmental movement behind me. And chief amongst them, the first among equals, the largest and strongest organization is the Society of Protection of Nature in Israel. And I was delighted when they asked me to speak to y'all because it doesn't happen by itself. And the ability to support the intelligent, professional, and highly idealistic staff that SPI comes makes my life so much better and allows me to be so much more professional and to be in more places than once. And so I want to take this opportunity to thank Jay and thank Iris Han and all of the very, very remarkable staff here in Israel. And thank all of you who are supporting us, because if we want to give our children a chance to enjoy the same kind of natural wonders that we've enjoyed, we have to act now. And part of that army to protect it is the Society of Protection of Nature in Israel. So that's my sort of opening pitch. And Jay, I'm happy to take any questions if people have some.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alon. Really appreciated that. Fascinating. Thank you for these great pieces of legislation that are moving their way through, and good luck on all that. I know we're on your side. And I also just want to mention your focus on mental health, the mental health benefits of nature. I know that's something that our CEO at Iris Han has talked about early in the COVID period, when she was teaming up with the head of the council, the physician who's the head of the Council for Public Health in Israel. And she can mention that. Iris will talk in a minute. I just wanted to say that, you know, a lot of countries recognize that. The state of Vermont, for example, doctors can prescribe write prescriptions, which are actually entrance fees to state parks in Vermont to relax in nature for people who have anxiety and stuff. And in Japan, there's a concept called a forest bath, which is just a refreshing way to, you know, refresh the soul in a forest. So it's really excellent that you're also focusing on those issues. Anyway, our CEO Iris Han is with us as well this evening in Israel from her home in Haifa. Iris, Avi, I hope we've changed it so people can see all of us on the screen. Iris, if you'd like to say a few words in response to and continuation of Alon's talk, and then we'll get to a bunch of questions. There's already many piling up, some of which you touched on, but people have questions. Iris?
Okay. Just, can you hear me? It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, just a few words, because I have no words. There are no words to describe how lucky and how blessed we are to have Alon Tal as a Knesset member. I'm many years in this business, and how did you say in the beginning? A legendary Knesset member. This is the right word. It's not only the knowledge and the deep understanding of the situation of environment, but he has endless energy. I don't know when he sleeps or when he rests. We find ourselves all the time running after him and all his initiatives and his laws and so on. And even today we had a work meeting in the afternoon to go over all the new laws that Alon is promoting. And we're very, very lucky to have him at the Knesset, and we're trying to do the best to take this time. As long as we have this Knesset and this government in Israel, you can never know what happens tomorrow. And to take this time to do as much as we can to protect the nature in Israel. And as Alon mentioned, the best way to protect nature is to protect open spaces, continuous open spaces, and representative. And this is our main goal, and we're doing it together. So thank you, Alon, and we have a lot of work to do together, and we'll continue to do it, because we know that, and I think you're a good example to see that sometimes only one person can make a change. So you are not alone. You have a really wonderful team, but one Knesset member can really make a change. And we're very lucky to have you in the Knesset. So thank you.
You're very kind. And Jay, before you take a question, I think I'd like to reciprocate by sharing the embarrassment with Iris Han. You know, there's a famous story that when Yitzhak Rabin, our late prime minister, was first prime minister, the first time he went, he was actually the chief of staff of the army, and he went to the finishing of the officers course. And the guy who was number one in the officers course, who won as the outstanding cadet, sat and talked for 5 minutes. And he said, you know, if this very, very talented young man doesn't become the chief of staff of the Israeli army, there's something wrong with the system. And that man was Ehud Barak, and indeed, he became the head of the army and eventually prime minister. So when Erez Hahn was a young physical planner who was in charge of planning policy at the Society of Protection of Nature Israel, I remember saying to my friend, I heard her, she had an original study about gas stations and their pollution. And I said, you know, if she doesn't become the director of the SPNI, there's something wrong with the system. So I'm delighted that the system works, and that I think Iris is the first woman. I'm certainly not the last woman who will be the director, but this says something very good about the organizational culture, that somebody can rise up through the ranks and reach the top who really deserves the position and is leading it from strength to strength.
As a Yofi, that's so nice. Thank you, Alon. And Iris, just to slightly correct you, I called Alon a legendary environmentalist. He's not yet a legendary Knesset member. He's kind of
working on it.
He's kind of a rookie Knesset member, but I believe it's going to be a long time and very, very influential. So
definitely feel like a rookie. Okay, let's take some questions.
Lots of questions. I'm just going to jump around. And the first one to continue with what our optimistic talk about what's going on in the Knesset. And you mentioned Minister Zandberg. Somebody asked, what can you talk about your cooperation with Tamar Zandberg? It truly is an incredible thing that you're both in the Knesset.
Okay, well, Tamar Zandberg is a fairly incredible Minister of Environment for several reasons. She's the first Minister of Environment who ever came who grew up in it. In other words, when she went for military service, she sometimes, if you're very lucky, if you're particularly women, but also some men, you get placed either as a teacher for the Society of Protection of Nature in Israel, or you work in the Nature Reserve Authorities. And she worked for the Nature Authorities in the Effect Nature Reserve in the Galley. So she came of age, those critical years, when she was 18, 19, 20 years old, working on nature preservation. So she gets it. And the first time I met her, she was the minister. I mean, she was in the Meretz party. She was the chairwoman. Then she's now number 2 in the party. But the first time we had a chance to chat in the Knesset chambers after I got elected, we're talking. She said, you know, I taught briefly, I was teaching in the policy department at Sapir. And I decided once I was going to teach a course in environmental policy. I said, well, that's great. And she said, and I used your book as a textbook. And I was stunned because I thought only my mother had read that textbook. It turns out that Tamar had and her students had. But the point is that she comes to this job where she hit the ground running. She wanted the position. It wasn't a booby prize like most Israeli politicians. It's the last ministry left, and that's what they get thrown at. She chose it, and she's doing amazing things with it. Recently, she made an extremely bold decision to prohibit any new risk in the Eilat Bay area, okay? And as a result of that, a most nefarious or scary contract between the Israeli, the Ashkelon Eilat pipeline, which takes gas and brings it all the way up there, and a company was stopped. 70 oil tankers would have brought huge amounts of petroleum to Israel, and they're not, because she simply toughed it out. I don't know if she had the legal authority to do it, but the government decided to fall into place. It's the first time I remember the Minister of Environment hushed all the economic ones, and she did this really based on her own convictions. And time and again, she's on the right side of the issues. You know, we look to her for great leadership, and she's bringing in money. That's also very important. The Ministry of Environment has always been a pitifully small, undernourished institution, and she brought in just, I think, 600 million shekels just for the ministry to work in the area of climate change, not to mention the 1.6 billion shekels which the Ministry of Energy has for renewable energy. So I think that what we're seeing in this government of change, and sorry for being such a cheerleader, but I am part of the coalition, is a real sea shift in the level of commitment. And then we saw it, of course, by the prime minister, who kind of smelled the coffee, got with the program, and made this very dramatic declaration before the Glasgow. I know Iris was at Glasgow; she can talk about it more. But the week before Glasgow, he says, "No, Israel in 2050 will join that elite group of nations that will have zero greenhouse gas emissions net." I mean, there'll be some room for sequestration, but the point is that a country that had been, it's almost a serial criminal in terms of our inability to put together a climate policy, is moving forward, and she's leading that effort, and I salute her.
Excellent, thank you, Alon. So we're, move along. I'm going to ask you I'm going to throw you a softball, which you could write a book about. I think you did, in fact, which is that Margaret Ben Nathan asks, can one take climate and environmental control seriously without a political policy of equivalent population control?
No.
In a minute or two.
No. We have reached a situation in Israel really where quantity of life is starting to impact quality of life. And this is something I've been talking about for 4 or 5 years, almost obsessively. My wife starts to, fall asleep at the dinner table when I see the world through this lens. But what I'm very, very pleased is that you hear more and more environmental organizations, including SBNI, recognizing that this is an issue. Now, it's a sensitive issue and it's complicated, but, we can ignore the phenomenon, but we can't ignore the impacts of the phenomenon, because they find us every day in the long waiting we're doing in the hospitals, or the traffic jams, or the most crowded classes in the world, or the amount of time we wait for a court case to come through. And of course, I mentioned already the loss of open spaces. So I've always felt, if you look at the world as well, of course, we have to deal with our consumption. Particularly in the West, it is out of control. We have to rein it in. But even if we did everything right, remember, Europe is only 8% of the emissions of greenhouse gases. If we don't stop the massive population growth in Africa, there's going to be 4 billion Africans, and every one of those children is born with a right to a carbon footprint. So we have to look at this issue in the planet and in Israel and realize, otherwise we're just trying to run on a treadmill that goes faster and faster, and we're not going to get there. So yes, I thank you for bringing up that point. It's a sensitive new issue for Israel's environmental community, but I don't think it's one we can no longer ignore.
Thank you. Some questions about animals. Michael Klein asks, I thought maybe tongue in cheek, but then I thought about an article I read today in Haaretz about the fact that more and more Israelis are moving to Haifa. It's a trendy city, but one of the problems of moving to Haifa is the boar invasion. And Michael Klein asks, you mentioned many animals that disappear from the land of Israel, specifically lions, bears, and crocodiles, which are all apex predators. Don't Israelis feel safer without apex predators? And I think about, what if lions were roaming the streets of Haifa?
So, Ben Gurion had this idea that we would bring back lions and put them in the craters around, or the mechdashim around the south of the country. I think it would be very interesting to hear your director's view as a Haifa resident, how she deals with this very complicated nature. I'm going to ask her, put her on the spot, so give her a 30-second warning. But I will say there was a great Israeli naturalist named Giora Elani, who was the chief of mammals or something for the nature, and he always complained that Israelis never appreciated how important the hyenas are. Where I live in wild boars, they're tame. We have hyenas roaming the streets in Modi'in. And luckily for us, the striped hyena that we have doesn't usually attack people. But yeah, this is one of the great dangers. We all know that the COVID epidemic started because of this unnatural connection or closeness between humans and animals. But there's all kinds of unfortunate ways. And, the reason why the hyenas love Modi'in is because people don't take care of their garbage, and there's a lot to eat there, and they're scavengers. So we're going to have to learn to live with these apex predators, and it's not easy. And unfortunately, we didn't do it very wisely with the leopards. But I think that we're going to have to find a balanced policy. And if you want to know how to make the balanced policy, we're going to hear it from Iris, who lives in Haifa and probably sees boars on a daily basis. So how do you see that, Iris?
Wow, it's the day talk in Haifa. There is no day that you go in Haifa anytime of the day, the middle of the day, and you don't see wild boars. And there is no solution for it. We don't know how to live. We still don't know how to live near or within with nature inside the city. The key solution is to keep, sometimes not to live with nature, but to make a kind of a separation. And there are people in Haifa that feed boars, and they feed them from their hands. Now, I can recognize some of the boars. I know in which area I will see and the same, I know that I will meet the same boars, and they got used to us, and we get used to them. And this is one of the main problems, because we don't have to be in such a contact with wild animals. I saw today, someone showed me a video from Mitzpe Ramon, from the desert, of people in Bereshit. It's a very fancy hotel, feeding the ibex from their hand, feeding them with trash, with sucrazit, with a low-fat sugar. I don't know the name.
That's like the most
sweet and low. Yeah, and it's awful. You see that, why? It's a wild animal. Don't touch it. Don't feed it. And it's a lot of work to do with it. It's not simple, because people
and there's the jackals in the Yarkon Park in Tel Aviv. Every city seems to have their favorite species that they're becoming way too tame and too domesticated. Let's go on, Jay.
Another family or genus of animals. Sandy Segalkin, our friend in Maryland, your neck of the woods, asked about insects, which are in serious decline all over the globe. I know our biodiversity expert, Alon Rothschild, occasionally brings that issue up. What do you have to say about insects in Israel?
Well, one of the good news I would say so far in Israel, when I was, I spent 2 sabbaticals not so long ago at Stanford at their Department of Biology. And the crashing of the bee population in the United States is one of the greatest concerns, because when we talk about ecosystem services, the pollination services are so important to farmers. And we're seeing that a lot of the bees are just disappearing. And there's different theories. It has something to do with the disease, and it's to do with pesticides. In Israel, we have over 100 different bee species, I believe, that are indigenous. And it doesn't look like they are dropping. There's an expert at the Hebrew University Agriculture Department in Rehovot. The last time I spoke with her, we haven't seen that kind of crashing yet. But the truth of the matter is that for many years, Israeli farmers were, how should I put it, excessively enthusiastic in the use of pesticides. And that doesn't bode well. And then what it does is, of course, it creates the superbugs. Recently, in recent years, we've been doing better. But one of the problems is that even if you are cutting back on your pesticides, but in Jordan, they're using heavily the pesticides, then those same bugs, which become insects, which become, they have, what's it called? Genetic, coming out with the word here, I'm losing my English. When a animal's genetic content changes quickly and it adapts to this, I'll think of it in a second. Then
mutations?
What?
Mutations?
Mutations, there's our word. So when it helps to sleep more than 4 hours to remember words. Anyway, when genetic mutations take place with insects and become basically, immune to different pesticides, you have to work with your neighbors on this. And this is something that is, we really haven't looked at it so well. But in general, I'm not a great insect expert, but clearly, the food chain starts there. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. We're moving into the rapid round here. We have 10 minutes left, and more questions appearing. So in a minute or less, and to continue on what you just mentioned about agriculture, a long question about agriculture, and basically can it be re-envisioned in Israel to become more biodynamic, permaculture, organic system, regenerative agriculture, etc. You just mentioned biological pest control. We support that a lot through our program Teva Biz, and Professor Yossi Leshem's just gave a webinar on using barn owls as pest control in biological insecticide. In a minute or less, what do you feel about the future of agriculture?
The trouble with Israeli agriculture, I lived on a kibbutz for many years. My wife is a dairy farmer, so my best friends are farmers, I would say. The trouble is that farming is going in the other direction, and particularly if you go in the south, we're going in the direction of these sort of massive greenhouses, and it doesn't even feel like agriculture. It's a very different kind of feel. Some of us believe that food in general is changing, and that very soon we'll be raising our food in skyscrapers, and that we'll be synthesizing meat in laboratories and the like. So the food is definitely changing. I wrote a report last year for an international foundation about the Israeli agri-tech and where it's taking us. But I would think that Israel, although in many areas where we're cutting back on pesticides, we become champions in terms of water efficiency. But I don't think that we're going in the direction of permaculture, because already we only produce 20% of our calories. We produce more if you want to start arguing that we make our own poultry and eggs, whatever, but we import all the feed. So only about 20% of the actual calories are produced in Israel. That's a very, very perilous place to be. So when I think about Israel, I'm very concerned about our food security. And although I love the idea of permaculture, from what I've seen, the levels of productivity are not going to be those which will allow us to have food security. Anyway, this is an area which I think Israel's agriculture is getting more environmentally sensitive, but it doesn't have some of the same sort of organic permaculture. Even though organic produce is getting more and more buyers over years, I don't think that's the direction that agriculture.
That's great. Alon, quick answers, and I'll just say to everybody whose questions we don't get to, if you have questions for Alon, we haven't gotten to them, please just send them to me or to Barry and our
I'll answer them. Okay, let's go. I'll be much
Alon and his staff, and he will answer them and keep you in.
Okay, wrap it. Sorry, I'll try to be shorter. Speed. Let's get
yes. Our board member Paul Citron in New Mexico asks, this is an excellent question. What's your opinion regarding the role of zoos in the preservation of species?
Well, there's this notion of in situ and ex situ preservation. When you go to some place like the San Diego Zoo and you realize how many endangered species are actually staying there, you realize that there is a place for it. In fact, the Biological Diversity Treaty talks about that. So yes, there is a place for it. The trouble is that if somebody who cares a little bit about animal welfare, you go down to the Chai Bar that the Nature Reserve Authority runs in the down south in the Arava, and it feels terrible. It feels like a cheap zoo and the animals suffer. So I think it's very, very hard to do that well. But in theory, I think that as habitats start to disappear, we want to preserve genetic stock. There's not going to be any alternative for it. And zoos will have more and more of a place as a genetic reservoir for the future.
How are the Jerusalem Zoo and the Safari in Ramat Gan doing? Any thoughts on
Better
that?
Than most. Better than most.
Good to hear. Dan Pava, who is an environmental planner and another board member of ours, also in Santa Fe, New Mexico, asks a good question, which is, do Israeli cities and regions have master plans that include open space and environmental elements? And if so, do these plans need to be consistent with larger national plans?
The answer is that cities have parks and they're planned in there. They have never been driven by questions of ecological systems, natural assets, species. But there are special places that have importance. The city of Eilat has something like 20 endangered species living inside the city. So there has to be, I think, a greater integration. But most cities have parks. The great exception, of course, is Arab communities, which for historic reasons basically don't have parks. There's a few very small where an old garbage dump was restored as a park, but basically they don't. And this is something we have to deal with. Luckily, they have the nature reserves and a lot of the forests. I did a big study on JNF forests about a year ago. Turns out Arab Israelis are much greater consumers of Israeli forests than Jews are, which is good. They should get out and see nature too.
Okay, cool. So we're almost wrapping up the hour, and I think people are beginning to leave. So I'll thank everybody again, and thank Alon really for this special hour. We already want you back. People want you in the States as well, Alon. I know members of Knesset have regulations on traveling, and I don't think we can send you, but if you're in the States and are available to talk to groups in general, public talks, our members would be very interested in.
Well, Jay, I just want to wrap it up by giving you a shout out, because you're responsible for some of the development. I just want to tell those people participating that Israel's environmental challenges and the ecological challenges of the planet in general are very, very serious, far, far too serious to leave this as a spectator sport. We need players. We need people in there. And the fact that you come to an ASPNI or SPNI webinar and then you're involved and you write a check or support these organizations, that is so important, because we all need to do our part, because we're not going to get a second chance. There's no dress rehearsal. And so thank you for what you're doing. And thank you for supporting the SPNI. As an Israeli environmentalist who's not a member, or I'm a member, but I'm not a lead in the SPNI, I don't think Israel's map would be anywhere near as pleasant and inspiring as it would be without the magnificent they've been doing now for almost 70 years, and hopefully for many, many more.
Thank you. Thank you. So well said. Appreciate it very much, Alon. If you have another couple minutes, we'll just go another couple questions.
Oh, I thought we were done. Okay, we'll take another one.
I have a feeling you might know Martin Lowenstein and his wife Inbar, but she asks, what there's San Francisco. Martin was on the board of Megamai Yeruka for a while in Israel, and Bar worked for Shatil. What's your opinion of the circular economy, which is very interesting? And I know that the Heschel Center just is launching a program with the donut economy, which is similar but not the same. What's your take on these issues?
I think it's the future. I would say just 2 weeks ago, the Journal of Sustainability put out a new journal on fast fashion and sustainable fashion. The opening article was written by my doctoral student, Meital Mizrahi, and myself about circular economy and the fast fashion industry and how to transform it. So yes, looking at industrial production as if it was a natural system, making sure that everything goes around just like in nature. That's the only real sustainable way forward. We look at a planet with limited resources. So I think it's extremely, extremely important to start studying this.
Okay. Should we just hit a slightly political question here, which is
what I do for a living.
It's what you do for a living. So, you know, Nancy Kaplan asks, I'll paraphrase here, but basically previous Israeli governments didn't have such a great environmental record. She wants to know, are there leaders in the Likud who are tuned into environmental issues? And if the opposition takes over, would we still see environmental protection going on at the same level in Israel?
There are two Likud members who seem to care about the environment. One of them is Gila Gamlieli, the previous Minister of Environment, who I think she actually learned. I don't think she went into the position caring that much, but she does now. And in his own way, Dr. Yuval Steinitz, our former Minister of Energy, has a lot of good things to say about nature preservation. I disagree with him about energy policy, but I think he comes from a real place of concern. So it's not like they don't care. They just don't care as much as the center left does, to be honest. And no, I'm serious. And I just, I found myself, it's not only the center left, this government is unique. I did something which made me wake up and say, what is going on here? The Messiah is coming tomorrow. I retweeted a post by Naftali Bennett, a right-wing political leader, now prime minister, because he posted that last week, Israel, on the week of Tu B'Shvat, declared a nature reserve in the Golan Heights for 81,000 dunams. That is huge. The second largest nature reserve in the center north of the country after Meron is now just declared. And that was done by this new government of change. And that's the kind of things we're going to need to do if we're going to save it forward. So I work across the aisle. There are Likudniks who care about the environment. We have to all bring this together. It is not imaginable that we would go the way of America and allow this to be a polarized issue. Yes, there are Likud members who care and have done great things. Then Gilad Ardan was a good environmental minister, but nobody liked the blue and white on this issue. So,
okay, maybe merits. One quick question, then I want to just end with a final comment. I don't know if there's the answer to this question, but a couple questions about invasive species that we've had both in the chat and questions. Can anything be done to solve the problem of minor birds in Israel? They're really quite a nuisance.
Maybe, but I don't know what they are. I think that train left a while ago. So yeah, just learn to love them. Once the Sabra was an invasive species, and we just eventually became to own it. I think minor birds are here to stay, ready or not.
Right. And I would be remiss in not just mentioning that there were a few questions about JNF, and if you could talk about JNF's environmental policies, and there are many questions I didn't get to, and that's
I suggest we let the JNF one go. That's a full other hour if we're going to do it.
I agree. An espionage relationship with JNF, which is
that's another hour.
Another hour, exactly. So, but you can write us. We put our emails in the chat, and Alon, I'm sure you can.
People want to know. I wrote a book called All the Trees of the Forest. Everything I think about it is there. If you have a problem with insomnia, 5-10 pages, it'll solve that problem. And if you really want to know about the JNF, it's all there. Forestry policy.
Yeah, it's not all about the trees, the JNF. Let's just be frank about that. So anyway, and it's not about always ecology. But and that being said, Alon, can we promise you'll be back at some point in future months?
We can make a yearly meeting here. I'm happy to do it. Whatever you need. I feel like I'm a reserve soldier in the SPNI Army. So you just have to send me a call-up order and I'll be there.
And seriously, our board members are all asking if you're in the States, they want to hear you speak. So, please keep us posted on that as well.
I have a brother-in-law in Abiquiu, New Mexico, which is an hour from Santa Fe. So who knows, maybe I'll go see the Santa Fe group there at some point.
I mean, that would be incredible. Or Albuquerque, that would be great. You got to fly in there probably. but yeah, anywhere around the States, we have supporters, Europe as well. You really, as a member of Knesset, have a unique voice to speak to the world with. So thank you very, very much. Thank you, Iris, for being with us tonight. Really appreciate it. I learned a lot as well. I hope everybody did. We got there about maybe 25 or 30 questions we didn't get to from the minute to the huge, but we will get to them. Alon is accessible, I can tell you. He's got the 3 very competent young assistants who work with him closely, and just produced an English language newsletter, which I received. So he'll be happy to send you that, and you can contact him through me.
Go on my Facebook page and like me. I don't have enough followers yet. I need 10,000. I'm working on it.
As well. And while you're on Facebook, don't forget to like the SBNI Facebook page, Society for Protection of Nature in Israel. You can also find online. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody. Thanks to everybody who's been with us for this this overtime. And we can now get to the 49ers game and within the hour. So thanks everybody.
תודה רבה, אלון.
אין בד מה.
תודה לכולם. תודה Avi in Toronto, and thanks everybody for watching, participating, joining, asking. Sorry I didn't get to a lot of the questions, but we will forward them and see you next time. Oh, special birding webinar is next Sunday. Usually we're every 2 weeks, but next week we have one on Sunday, and we have it at a very early time because we need to catch the daylight. So that will be a birding spectacular from all of our birding sites next week at 2 hours earlier, I believe. If I'm not, no, I think many hours, several hours earlier. I don't know. It's on. You'll receive an email already. Starts at 3 p.m. Israel time, 8 a.m. New York time. So that's a week from today, and then we'll see you 2 weeks from today with another webinar. So, and we will keep you posted. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it. Signing off from Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Alon in Modi'in. Navi, thank you. Bye to everybody.